I'd like to talk this evening about, largely about intersubjectivity, and let me explain why. I think that there has been a progressive shift, incomplete, but very important, in going from, for psychoanalysis I'm speaking mainly, in going from an intrapsychic point of view to an interpsychic point of view. We now talk a lot about, well, there's a first-person psychology or a one-person psychology, and then there's a two-person psychology. That may be a crude way of putting it, but it's not so wrong. And there has been a growth in the two-person psychology, such as relational psychoanalysis and even self-psychology and attachment and other object relations influences that sort of push the system a little bit more towards two people instead of one person. And where what happens interpsychically starts to become more important. Now, tonight, I don't want to get into the issue of which schools are right and where they are with regard to this shift. They're all relative anyway. Everybody has to use both. Where the emphasis is what's really different. I don't want to get into that. I think that everybody can draw their own conclusions. What I want to do is, in a sense, bring you up to date as to what the intersubjective point of view is, because there's been an unbelievable explosion in research and thinking about what constitutes intersubjectivity, and that has a lot of bearing on how we look on the theory and perhaps aspects of the practice of psychoanalysis or most forms of talking therapy for that matter. So I'm going to take a nonpartisan point of view from that point of view, and maybe we can get into the partisan issues later, but they're not uppermost in my mind. If you want to move the therapeutic enterprise more towards a two-person interpsychic situation, then maybe the most crucial question starts to be something like, how do I know that you know that I know? And how do you know, and how do I know that you feel that I feel? And how can the therapist and the patient say that to each other or think that to each other? How do I know that you felt that I was doing that when in fact, etc., etc.? You go down the whole thing. So this business of how do two people know what is the psychic landscape of the other, and whether the two of them are in the same psychic landscape, or whether they're not, how much overlap is there. And the issue is not, is somebody wrong when they say, I know that you know? The issue is, how do they even imagine that they could say it? Theoretically, how do we deal with the situation where you can say, I feel that you feel that I feel that you feel? You could go on like that for a while, too. This becomes the key question in considering a move towards the interpsychic. And so that's where I want to sort of start and make sure we have some kind of understanding, consensus about it. I'm going to start developmentally, since that's the way I go about things and it's easier. Well, this isn't exactly developmental, but this issue of how you know is new to science and to psychology in a sense, but it's an ancient issue. All of the great philosophers from the beginning have asked this question. And so many of them have come up with a philosophical notion that you know it because a human being is born with what they call an open mind. What that means is that there's something about the human condition, the nature of being a human being, that makes it such that your mind receives another person, whatever happens, as if they were like you. It is like a primary basic assumption. It doesn't require much learning or anything else. It's part of our condition. So the philosophers, in a way, have been way ahead of us, but have not been interested in the mechanisms in particular, since they know that it's true that we are born with open minds, and indeed we seem to be. But they have called our attention to it as an essential fact that we have to take into account. I want to give you an overview of some of the recent research. You all probably know about early neonatal imitation. I'll give you just a quick, brief run-over. Turns out that a baby, I'm not going to give the references, perhaps we can talk about that later. If you take a neonate, day-old, 6 hours old, doesn't matter, and you get them in a good state, and you stick out your tongue. These are Andy Meltzoff's. Just like that, the baby will look at you, and after a few seconds, the baby will stick out his tongue. It's not a reflex, they don't always do it, but they do it enough reliably that it has been repeated all over the world now. Now, if you think about it, this is a crazy situation, because the baby doesn't know that he's got a face, and he doesn't know he's got a tongue, and he's not even looking at that in himself. So he sees the mother or the experimenter do something, but for him it's a three-dimensional spatial movement. That's all it is. He has to translate this spatial movement into a proprioceptive sensation of his own mouth opening and sticking out his tongue, which requires some kind of cross-referencing, some kind of switchover, a transfer from one modality, looking, to another modality, sensing in a proprioceptive way, and the motion part of it. Nobody knows how they do this. This is quite mysterious, yet they do it. They not only will imitate sticking out your tongue, they will imitate opening your mouth. A recent group in Scotland have shown that they'll do this most extraordinary thing with their hands. This is still 1 day old, 2 days old. If you go like this to the baby, and they have your attention, you know, babies then, they don't really look like that at something. They kind of look fuzzily, you're not even sure, but they see very well. Their peripheral vision is excellent. So what you do is you go like this. Keep on raising the finger. And after a few seconds, the baby at 12 hours will go like that. Now, babies do it in different ways because they don't have complete control. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll go like this. As if too much had happened, they had to course correct it. Sometimes they won't do it. Now, once again, they don't know about your hand. It's a visual thing, and they're not watching their own hand anyway. So it falls into the same mystery of early imitation. It's not the same as I know that you know, but we're starting to touch something at the base of this kind of capacity, having to do with some connection between different minds, so that something that goes on inside can be shared or communicated in some way. Now, I assume, and Tamara gave me the green light, that most of you know about the mirror neuron system. That's pretty much true. Let me just say a few sentences to make sure. They've found that in the brain there is this part which has what they call these mirror neurons. Basically, it's this: if you see somebody perform an action, you just watch them. You don't have to do it. And what happens is that this part of the brain fires as if you were doing the same action. In other words, the same neurons that would have done it get stimulated in some way, but they don't hit the level where they actually commit the act. So you're having a vicarious experience of them doing it, and it's physical, it's in your brain, it's the way we work. So that this is why when you watch a dancer or an athlete do things, you're sitting in your chair and you're often going like this, and you're doing a whole lot of things and leg liftings because your mirror neurons are firing off as you do it, and you can't always get them under control, especially if you're alone. One of the interesting things, and you'll see where this is so, is that one thing where autistic children, infants more, are not good at is imitating how somebody does something. They get very crude about it. And there are now several studies that do indicate that autists seem to have fewer mirror neurons in their brain from the beginning. And the more severe the symptomatology, like rocking and head banging, thank you, the fewer mirror neurons they'll have. So that starts to give us another sense. And one of the things about an autistic child, of course, is that they seem to be bad, for whatever reason, at intersubjective tasks of knowing what it is that you know that I know, etc. So this becomes another little piece of the puzzle. When you watch, comes another piece. A mother and a baby play, this is at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, etc., where they don't play with anything except their hands and face. You see these games of peekaboo and sort of getting one another excited and going, I'm going to get you, and stuff like that between the mother and the baby. When you watch these closely, what happens is that babies get to anticipate and predict the intentions of the mother, such that she can play with them. So, for instance, if she's going to start to build up a suspenseful thing, the baby can start to raise their eyebrows and look at her and get all excited. And as the baby gets more excited, the mother will key up whatever she's doing to a higher level of excitement. And then at a certain point, the baby frequently will act like he's going to go over. He said, okay, I'm ready, let's go. And then she has her act released. These little things, like saying hi. But it goes on all the time. It requires more than just being conditioned to how a game gets out. I mean, it requires some kind of sense of what the intention of the other person is and when it's going to fall, when it'll actually happen. Then at about 7 months, you get this business of pointing. So when babies start to point in a social way, they point at an object, but they don't just do that. They then look at their mother. So they'll triangulate the object and the thing, because what they really want is her to turn her head and to look at the same thing. In other words, so they're sharing the same visual landscape, so that their mental activity can overlap with regard to what is the subject of their being together at that particular moment. So there's a different kind of intersubjectivity that goes on, you see quite early. And then there's also using emotions to trigger this intersubjectivity. This happens towards the end of the first year of life. You've seen a mother and a baby walking on the street, and the baby can just walk now, they're 11 months, let's say. And the baby falls down and scrapes its knees and hands. And they're really very hurt, rarely. And what the baby will do is immediately turn around and look at his mother's face. Now, if the mother goes like that, the baby will cry. And if the mother goes, oh, you fell again, the baby will laugh, get up, and continue to walk. And you see this in all kinds of situations, so that what they do is they use the face as they can read it in order to adjust and to calculate, in a sense, and to dose what they're going to be feeling inside and what they're going to be showing, so that they come into some kind of equilibrium. When you watch, here's another piece of evidence about this whole development. When you watch school kids, preschool really, kindergarten and 4-year-olds and that, when you watch them in the playground during recreation, and there are no teachers or parents around, it's during the period of time where the parents and teachers are somewhere in the background, you watch them play. Several observers have observed that the two most frequent things that kids do when left alone like that is, one is imitate one another, and the second is a combination of lying, tricking, cheating, and generally mucking up. In some places, this is as much as the imitating. Now, think about it. A lying is bad, we're told. Yet, from the intersubjective point of view, it's got to be one of the great landmarks of human mental development. Because you can't lie to somebody if you haven't said to yourself, I know that they think that such and such, or I know that they're going to feel this way if I do nya. That's the basic condition for lying. And so any kid who can lie to you has already achieved a very large part of what humans being for all forms of our negotiations and whatnot with one another. And this is what they do. They spend their time when they're not in the classroom learning about real life as to how intersubjective, inter-psychic events get negotiated between people. This is like real school. This is like street smarts. This is like what it's all about. And then they go to class and learn mathematics or something like that. So this is really where they learn the other stuff. Now, there's one other thing that gets important for the intersubjective. That has to do with language. More and more, we conceive of language as having a variety of functions. One, of course, is the symbolic functions that we know about, and it's one of our major expertise as psychoanalysts. Developmentally speaking, people like Lakoff and Johnson talk about what they call primary metaphors. These are the metaphors, the mental constructs that get developed prior to language, like up, down, in, out, go or not go, things like that. There are concepts in the mind about how to do that, and language gets constructed on top of that. So, for instance, if you have a kid who's 12 months old who can toddle around, start to toddle around the house and goes here, and then stops and looks and turns to the right and goes over there, and they do this 1,000,000 times a week, Then later, when he can speak, and he has a girlfriend, and his friend's got a girlfriend, and he says, so how's it going with your girlfriend? And his friend says, I don't know. The relationship started out real well, and then somehow or other it stopped. Just stopped moving. And I don't know, at that point, it stopped right there. Where is there, by the way, in the relationship? What is he talking about? Then I think she went her way and I went my way. You can only understand that like this if you already have a concept of what does it mean to start, to stop, to go in different directions and whatnot, which is not a linguistic piece of knowledge initially. It's a body piece of knowledge that gets encapsulated in these primary metaphors, and there are hundreds of them when we use them all the time. And these people can share very readily. They all know them because they've all done them. So it is not quite as removed from direct experience as language is. Now, most of us know about these things. Let me just say one other thing about the mirror neuron system. The mirror neuron system is super at telling you what is the other person going to do. In other words, the what of the act, the intention of the act, to scratch their head or do whatever, and the why of the act, because the context usually tells you the why. You don't need a whole lot of machinery to know what the why is. So you know what and why people do things the way they do. This is basic primary knowledge that your mirror neurons will give you, and you know what it feels like to do what the other is doing, and to have some comprehension of the incentive for doing it. Now, I've mentioned how you know what somebody's doing or is going to do and why. I haven't said anything about how. I haven't said anything about the style, the way in which it's done. And this starts to become very important. It's something the mirror neuron people are just beginning to work on. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about, because it's a fascinating story, and I haven't had a chance really to talk about it yet. So if I fumble along a little bit, go with me, because I'm still working on it, as it were. One of the things where psychology in general, psychoanalysis as part of general psychology, is not so good at either, is talking about temporal dynamics, not psychodynamics, temporal dynamics. What does it mean to feel the passage of something happening and how it happens? How do we talk about that? We really don't have much of a language for it. Now, the only people who talk about this in any reasonable fashion and have given it a lot of thought, besides a few rare psychologists and a few rare philosophers in a way, are artists. They have to deal with it. This is what it's all about. It is this that touches and moves the audience. It is how something gets done. You're not interested in the technical performance, you're interested in an interpretation. The interpretation is the how something was done, not what was done, nor the why. It's the stylistic, personal signature that is stamped on all experience that lets you know, in fact, what the other person is experiencing. And so it falls right back into our problem of intersubjective communication. Because remember, when we're talking about intersubjective communication, and I didn't say this at the beginning, which I should have, we're talking about everything that falls under the roof of what we generally speak of as empathy, which means, in this case, identification, all kinds of taking in, projective identification, sympathy, certain forms of contagion. Everything that has to do with that is really what is at essence here and what is the problem. And as I say, knowing what somebody's going to do or is doing and feeling it and why is relatively simple, even technically, and the Neuron people have got a good handle on it. Now I want to stay with this thing of the manner in which something is done, which tells you more about the subtleties of what somebody's feeling and trying to express to you as their therapist, and which you have to be able to feel with them in order to know the nuances and the personal aspects of their current experience. And as I say, it's the artists who are going to tell us the most about it. Now, what do I really mean by temporal dynamics? We usually don't think of it that way. Here is an example, not from psychology, from Albert Einstein. He had been asked, do you think in pictures or do you think in words? He said, neither. He said, I think in terms of forces and volumes moving in time and space. That is my basic metaphor. And unless I can see, feel all of those things happening, I don't know what's going on. Forces and volumes moving in time and space. Moving is important here. He also said that until I can get that concept of a force, etc., and moving in time and space, into my body so that it becomes part of my sensory motor experience, I cannot write a formula for it. That's the step that I need before I go to the verbal or the mathematical. He's talking about temporal dynamics, plus other things. Now, let's take a mother and a baby. Baby's looking at the mother and they're having a social interaction, and the mother's face is all animated. And what does the baby see? Well, her eyebrows shoot way up. That's one volume that flies up. And at the same time, her mouth opens, big and wide, and her head goes back like this. And then she comes forward a little bit from the side and whatnot to close down the expression, and the baby is delighted. That's what happens when you zoom in from the cosmos to the interaction between a mother and a baby. We've just zoomed in. We're no longer out in Einstein's cosmos. We're in the micro world of an interaction between a mother and a baby, where what the baby sees on the mother's face consists of forces and volumes moving in time and space. That's what it's about. And it all starts with movement. Movement is the key, and more we think about it that way. It's at the center of the whole problem of feeling with other people, or being empathic, or in fact having the nuances of their experience that get inside of you so that you vicariously have the same ones. Now, I'm going to try to pull together movement, force, time, space, and directionality. I don't mean to be grandiose. This is not. I'm taking the basic things that are already there. I'm not trying to do anything extraordinary. What I'm saying is that They come together rather naturally for reasons that are quite unclear, and they form a sort of gestalt. And the gestalt that they form, I'm going to call a form of vitality. It is the form that vitality, in the sense of a living organism and a living act or a living thought or a living feeling, takes on some kind of form so that it's one coherent thing and you don't have to take it apart each time. And in that sense, it's a gestalt. They are all tied to movement at the bottom. Here's a funny thing historically. You know, as I read and reread Freud, which I do a lot, I have arguments and nice things with him frequently when I'm trying to understand something. And you know, Freud knew that action was really at the bottom of thought in a certain way. You know, directed action, etc. But that was the primary issue of being a human being. And this is what most of the more modern sort of evolutionary biologists have come to. They've said, listen, first there's movement, nothing else. Then movement can differentiate into approach and withdrawal. And they can differentiate further into the different kinds of emotions, like fear and joy and all of those other things. And then you can add other psychic qualities about it, like what was that all about? But it starts with movement. When you watch a fetus, I'm sure many of you have seen them in echograms, the most, for me, shocking, extraordinary thing was how much they move, how delicate and purposeful a lot of their actions are. They have all kinds of actions, such as bringing the hand to the mouth, or to the wall, or to the belly, to the, the cord. At about 16 weeks of gestation, this kind of motion to the head is no longer ballistic in the sense that it was just thrown out and the hand hits the face. It starts to come under some kind of goal-directed guidance. It's no longer a missile. It becomes something that's controlled. So there's a soft landing. That requires some form of primitive intentionality to the act. So that you can see movement and it's the things necessary for it from the very beginning. I see, for the most part, this pentad, if you wish, of movement, force, time, space, and directionality. Not only as a gestalt, but I see movement as at the center, and I like to think of it as movement and her four daughters. Her four daughters are force, direction, time, and space, since they take that time. You can't move without using up time or space. They go together necessarily. That's why I say it's one thing, there's nothing new here. It's new to think of them as subjective gestalts. Well, all gestalts are subjective. Think of them as gestalts. But I think that it makes our life easier in thinking about the construction of especially social and emotional reality of being with other people. I'll get to that, because remember I started this discussion by talking about how do you really know what somebody's feeling at the personal level besides at the more general level of what they're doing. Remember, this concerns the how you do things. Let me give you a list of adverbs. I'm just picking out some of them now, like rushing, exploding, fading away, pulsating, stuff like that. What are these things? They are not emotions. They are not sensations. They are not thoughts. They are not movements. They are forms of vitality. They, in fact, fall between all the cracks. We have no science of them, and they have to do with temporal dynamics, which is what we're talking about. And it is these that make up an artistic performance, besides the content, and make up the nuances of interpersonal communication that becomes intrapsychic and intersubjective, so that you know much more than just what and why somebody's doing something. You know how it feels for them to do that particular thing at that particular moment. Let me talk a little further about the arts. They are a special form of information for us because they're one of the few things besides other human beings talking to us or whatever that can move us very deeply on the spot. And they move us in ways that frequently the language can't quite cover, or it can, but not with effort and with inexactitude. Let me attack the problem of how the arts work using forms of vitality that will get us back to this empathy thing. Two questions. One is, how would we ever notate or have a coding system for forms of vitality? What do you do so that you could even tell another scientist what you're talking about? So you have to have a coding system. And the other is, how could artists ever collaborate with each other across modalities? How could a visual artist collaborate with an auditory artist or whatever? Let me talk a minute about notating things. I'll start with music. You know, there are centuries and centuries of coding that has gone into the system that we use for marking classical music. It's taken all these years, and also advances in instruments like going from the harpsichord to the piano forte, to really develop a coding system for all of the forms of vitality that are not notes and they're not speeds per se. What they are is how you get yourself through a phrase. So, for instance, you have simple things like piano, pianissimo. You don't write small notes, you just tell the person to do that. Or crescendo, decrescendo, accelerando. Even of things for things like, what feeling tone are you going to give for an attack? Like when the pianist sort of gets ready and then starts the piece with, like that. They jump on it, you know, and the audience goes like this, because you feel it. That's a sforzando. Now, they've had to develop all of this so that somebody could reproduce the music, obviously the composer wanted, and also so people could coordinate if they had to. Something like the sforzando is particularly interesting because anybody who's ever seen a pianist, or even if you probably haven't, you know that more force was involved to attack the note that way. If you see me bring this thing down here, your mirror neurons went like this. You knew that I was doing a tearing motion. So they work across modalities. So that when you hear a sforzando, you know that the pianist or the violinist or whoever it was readied themselves, had to have a preparatory phase, and then put more gravity or force into the act, which they have to. Pianist tells you, well, what they do is they lean forward and they get more on top of the piano so that they can come down with gravity helping their own stuff. When you think of some of the classical composers like Beethoven, you know, he's sort of like a master at fiddling with forms of vitality to keep us aroused. So he will take a simple theme, like a 4-note theme, like da-da-da-da, and he will then move it around, each time changing its form of vitality, so that each time it reawakens you and you rehear it, etc., etc. And he plays on these forms of vitality throughout the whole first movement, for instance. Let's talk about dance. How do you score dance, and what have they had to do for that? That's harder. They didn't have a good coding system for court dances in the Louis XIV period and after. It wasn't really until the 20th century when a man named Laban came along, who was sort of the grandfather, the father of dance notation systems. He created what they call Laban notation, which is currently still used, where he described, this is for ballet for the most part, he described the positions, he described the steps, he described that for the upper body, for the lower body, he described the jumps, the partnering positions that were in it all. And it's still a classical, even now, some of the better, I shouldn't really say that, I should say ballet houses that have more money still use the Laban notation along with 3 or 4 cameras to capture the performance. And they can't do it with the cameras alone. They still need the Laban notation to capture the nuances. Now, Laban's idea was he wanted to have a system so that somebody from Uzbekistan could do a duet with somebody from South America. None of them had seen the dance before and they didn't know each other, but they could read the notation system like music and actually get the dance done faithfully. But what they would get faithfully done is the classroom steps of it. After he was finished, he succeeded. It was a wonderful system. He said, but I've missed the spirituality in dance. I haven't captured the thing that captures you. So we went back and he added to his system things like flow, effortfulness, and whatnot, harmony, all of the things that fall into our forms of vitality. They couldn't be grasped in the other system because that's where, in fact, the idiosyncrasy or the personal signature of the dancer was revealed. Take film, cinema. There you see, let me just say a quick word about cinema, so it's so easily understandable. There are only a few things in cinema. There's the frame of the shot, which is a shot. I mean a frame. Then you string together, 3-4 seconds worth of progressive frames, but it's coherent in itself, and that constitutes a shot. It's like a little theme, it's like a melodic line of music. And then you can string those together and you get more like a scene or a scenario. The only other thing you've got is to change your framing device. So you can have close-ups, and you can have far-ups, and you can change it. You can change the speed at which you change it. So it starts to begin to look like music in a funny way. Take The Birds, Hitchcock's famous film, The Birds. Here's the story. Melanie and Mitch, a girl and a boy, a woman and a man, meet at a party. They really like each other. they leave, and she wants to see him again. And he lives on a cove of water, and there's a port here, and his house is across the water there. So she goes with a present for his sister, which is an excuse. And she gets into a little putt-putt motorboat to see him. She gets there, nobody's home. So she leaves the present, she starts back. At that point, his car pulls into the driveway, and she sees it. And he sees her going away in the little boat. And they look at each other. Now Hitchcock starts to deal with these notes that he's got and these forms of vitality. And what does he do? First shot, he goes back and forth. Melanie, car. Melanie, car. And they're both doing different things as they watch each other move through time and space here. So you got Melanie, where she's framed about like this, first shot. And you see the car start to move around the bay towards the port where she'll land. Then the next shot is of Melanie watching the car move, and now she's framed tighter. So she's a little bigger. You go this through another one, and now she's framed like this, and you see the car is really moving because now the camera starts to move with the car. So you get a different sense of movement than a still. I mean, the way the camera is still and the car's moving. Then you expect the next shot of her to even be a tighter close-up as the tension mounts, as the meeting is about to happen. I mean, this is a love story. What happens is he pulls back the frame. And so emotionally, without knowing why, you say to yourself that the vitality form of this flow, of this crescendo, has been interrupted and stopped, as you might in a piece of music. And then in the next frame, what happens is a bird falls from the sky and hits her in the head. And this is the beginning of the bird story. She finally gets to the port, and Mitch and she get together and they hug each other and say, what was that about? But it's no longer a love story. The whole thing has been shifted by that. And the whole crescendo of the meeting has been stopped for this other thing. So this is the way the filmmaker would do the same music, using these shifts in the way it flows and whatnot that are very hard to describe. Let me now talk about the second problem, which is how in the world can you collaborate if you're in different modalities as artists? Because believe me, this really bears on the whole issue of empathic dealings between people. And we're talking about the style of being who you are at that particular moment. And remember, every one of us has our own personal movement signature. You can recognize somebody close walking 50 meters behind them from the way they walk. You can know who it is in the next room if they cough or just sigh. And in fact, you learn this stuff from your parents, the people around you. It's sometimes surprising to hear yourself do something like a sigh, which is such a private, silly thing, like, and realize it's exactly the way your mother or father sighed, and you have no idea how you could possibly have learned that if it wasn't like a phrase in a musical score that has a how it gets done, of the flow of it in time, of its temporal dynamics and whatnot. So let's talk about how they collaborate. Wagner, in the 19th century, really threw this whole thing into a new perspective. He said, we have to have an artistic revolution. He said, all of the different art forms have gone about as far as they can go. Nobody's going to write better music than Beethoven. Nobody's going to write a better play than Shakespeare, so on. He said, what has to happen now is the different modalities have to fuse, the different forms of art, to create something new and transcendent beyond, to revolutionize and refresh, to make a renaissance in the world of art. Well, this was a dominating idea that carried really through the whole 20th century, and still a little bit now. The question is, how do you do it? Well, around 1900 or so, the symbolists in France tried it. This is with people like Mallarmé and Baudelaire. And with them, they had a whole group of other people. They had the artists, they had Bonnard, they had Toulouse-Lautrec, they had Satie, and they all worked together. They're trying to fuse their stuff to create something transcendent, to create what they called correspondences between the art forms so that you would get to even another place. But once again, how would that be working? Well, one of the reasons it could work was that all of the art forms shared one common coinage. In other words, they had a language in common. They had an Esperanto. And what was the Esperanto? Forms of vitality. The temporal dynamics of what was going on. This is what permitted them to do these extraordinary things. Then Diaghilev came to Paris later in the 1900s and created the Ballet Russe. And he had the best choreographers around, Fokine and Massine and Balanchine and Nijinsky. And he had Stravinsky, he had, as artists, Braque, he had Picasso, he had Matisse. And together they would do things to try to get to some transcendent point where they all did it and they were all talking the same language of forms of vitality that worked together in some way that they could move you. Because remember, when you're watching your patient or listening to them, it's a lot of different modalities thrown in all at the same time, and you have to integrate them so that the feeling of who they are at that moment comes through in these subtle things. And this is what I think experienced therapists who have the time to really get into it and not worry too much about technique and whatnot can really do. There was a fascinating collaboration between Prokofiev and the Russian film director, thank you, Sergei Eisenstein. They were working on a movie, and they worked very closely. And what happened was, let's say Eisenstein had a film. This was, I think, Alexander Nevsky, where the Russian army is up on a hill, and then they kind of go down like that to the right. And so he'd show that shot, which could be repeated a number of times to Prokofiev. And Prokofiev would write into that phrase of music something that corresponded. It wasn't the kind of correspondence of the music went downhill. It wasn't that. It was something that made more of that. I don't remember what it was. And they did this for every frame, or every shot, rather, of the film. This is a huge kind of commitment and correspondence to an attempt to use their ability to deal with vitality forms so as to get into one another's head and to accomplish what they needed to. And of course, the rest of the century with John Cage and Cunningham, and then the other school, the Bauhaus, all were about this in one form or another. I'm going to try to wrap up here. What I've tried to tell you and talk about tonight is that we do have some ideas now about, we're getting closer to thinking about the basic issues and elements of empathy in the large sense. And I'm not going to try to define whether we're talking about feeling in or feeling with or all of that. Let's worry about that later. Let's get this down. And I've tried to talk about how early this forms, how it is non-verbally initiated, how it creates concepts which are initially non-linguistic, how it not only lets us know what another person is doing, the what of what they are actually doing so we can reproduce it, but it lets us know why they're doing it if we can see the context. And finally, it brings in this new domain of forms of vitality, which is not the what, and it's not the how and the why, but it's the how, the personal signature, the thing that turns something that's fairly strict and rigid and schoolhouse steps or notes into something that's an expression of the internal state of the other person in ways that we don't have a good manner to talk about. And so I've tried to add that into what has to go into what we really mean by empathy when we're talking about being with another person and understanding who they are at that moment. I think that this is the kind of knowledge we need, and this is the kind of knowledge that inevitably has come along as there has been a movement, however great or permanent it is, from the intrapsychic to the interpsychic. And that's what I've been trying to talk about. Thank you.